I'm just going to ask you first to take a minute and with somebody beside you, tell them, if you can, name a fairy tale, and then tell them the moral of that fairy tale if you can think of it. Just give you a minute. So, homework before you even got a lesson. How about that, huh? So we grow up on those fairy tales, right? And usually there's a story, there's a hero, there might be a villain. There's always seems to be a moral to the story, whether that's something like, the Three Little Pigs, and it's always make sure your house is built right. Good construction matters. Or Goldilocks, have respect for other people's stuff. There's all kinds of different lessons that we can have, and as we approach the scriptures, I think sometimes we can treat parables the same way. Jesus told these stories, these parables, and we can look at them and hear the story, and Jesus will tell us about these characters and something that happens, and we might be able to think of what is the moral of that story, and it can sometimes kind of read similar to a fairy tale. And so as we consider that this morning, as we look at our passage and the parable that's told there, I want us to think about the fact that there might be a difference. I mean, other than the fact that this is a lesson or a story with a spiritual lesson, that there might be something to a little more complex than that. So our story this morning has a rich man, and then has a manager who's an employee of the rich man, who works for him and handles his accounts. And then there's a bunch of people, debtors, who owe money to the rich man and have to deal with the manager about how much they owe. And so as our story starts to unfold, we find out the manager has been wasting the money of his boss. And we're not told exactly how, but he's kind of given his old-fashioned equivalent of 2 weeks' notice, right? You're going to be fired. You're not fired this minute, but you're going to be fired. And so he tries to think up a plan, and he marks down the bills owed to his boss in order to win friends so he doesn't end up homeless after the firing. And so it plays out that way. And then the result is, as our scripture tells us, the rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. That doesn't sound like a really good lesson to teach our kids, does it? So he says, the rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. Why would we admire a guy who's a dishonest rascal? And is that really a lesson we want to take away and go, when you meet somebody that's dishonest, that's kind of able to get ahead because they didn't do things honestly, boy, don't you think that's the greatest? Getting away with stuff? And being able to get ahead whether you're doing the right thing or not. And so why in the world would the landowner, the rich guy, why would he admire this guy, his manager? Is Jesus trying to say the end justifies the means? As long as you get results, good on you. Lesson ended, go home. No, right? And so we look at it, and this is a kind of a complex, this is one of the reasons we look at parables and go, they are not exactly fairy tales. Fairy tales are written for children, so the story is usually pretty straightforward. And the lesson is one you can go, okay, that's the lesson most of the time. And so it may get a little weird with bears and houses and stuff like that, and pigs, but hey, there's a lesson that's kind of on the surface for us to grab. And this parable doesn't meet that kind of format. There are parables that are fairly clear, but there is more to them. And so I was speaking with one person this week and talking about this parable and trying to see what their obvious reaction to it was. It's kind of a complex one. And I said, what do you think of this? And they said, it makes you wonder if the rich man himself was shady, and that's why he admires the manager. The manager's shady, he's shrewd. Maybe the rich guy is also shady and shrewd, and that's why he admires him, and we shouldn't really be following that example at all. Because the manager, says, I'm going to be fired, And I want to ensure I have plenty of friends who will give me a home after I'm fired. And so he's got this idea that he's going to get ahead, and admiring that seems kind of crazy. And so there's different ways that we can reconcile it. Wonder, is it because he's shady himself? I'd never thought of that. I'd never encountered that idea, but it sounds like a plausible theory on the surface of it. So the manager's about to be fired. He says, I'm too weak to dig ditches. I'm too proud to beg. So he comes up with a plan. I know how to ensure that I'll have plenty of friends who'll give me a home when I'm fired. And so he comes up with this plan that he's going to enact. Now, Jesus sums up the moral teaching by saying, here's the lesson. Use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. Then when your possessions are gone, they will welcome you to an eternal home. So Jesus takes a lesson, and there's a guy and his manager, and the manager is kind of crooked to get ahead so that he makes sure he's got friends after he's fired. He's looking at his future. And Jesus says, here's the lesson. Use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. Then when your possessions are gone, they'll welcome you to an eternal home. So it almost sounds like a spiritualized version of what the manager did. So Jesus isn't saying he's a cautionary tale. He seems to be saying there's a lesson in what this guy did. So he definitely seems to be suggesting the lesson comes from the manager's action. So it creates more tension, right? It's not that he's shady. It's that there's something going on here other than that. Another explanation that I came across that's kind of prevalent in studies on the passage is that some have suggested that the reason it's okay to admire the manager is that this time he's not actually cheating his boss. That what he's doing when he marks down the bills for everybody, they said, well, maybe he's not writing down the actual principal sum owed to the boss. Maybe he's writing off his commission. Maybe he's just saying, well, I'll take the portion that would have been mine, my income for this transaction, and I'll give that back to the guy who's paying the bill, and he'll be so happy, I'll have a friend, and he'll look after me after I'm fired. He's reducing the bill. This is not a dishonest act, more of a, come to Jesus moment where he decides he's actually going to be honest for once. And that's another theory. They're trying to grapple with how is he doing something admirable. And so in that scenario, describing him as dishonest is referring to not to how he marks down the bills, but some form or action. The thing he was fired for example. And so he's not actually doing something with the boss's money. He's doing something with his own. So admirable rather than corrupt. But there's a problem if you look in the text that his reason for firing doesn't say that he was dishonest or that he stole from his boss. It says that he wasted his employer's money. So it's not really listed the same way. There's not even any indication of whether that was intentional or whether he was just incompetent. He wasted his boss's money. Maybe he's not very good with money. Maybe he just makes poor choices. Or maybe he's made some really bad choices, like things that are wrong. We don't know. But either way, it seems to be about wasting money, and that's a little different than being dishonest. You're not always dishonest if you're wasteful with your money. Some of us know that firsthand, right? You spend money and then you go, I shouldn't have bought that. But you're not stealing from anyone. You just made a bad choice. And so why would Jesus leave it unclear, right? Why would he say in his parable that the guy was wasting money and then later call him dishonest and a rascal? And why wait till you're saying that the boss had to admire him for the first time call him dishonest? And so it doesn't totally make sense. And if you dig a little deeper, what about the markdown itself? 800 gallons of olive oil, and he marks it down by half and says, just make it 400. So he gives him a 50% discount. Seems like a high commission. 1,000 bushels of wheat marked down to 800, which is a 20% reduction. Still a significant value, but not exactly the same. Is his commission vary? And one time he gets 50% and one time he gets 20%? Doesn't totally make sense, at least in our modern ears. Would it be odd if they were different percentages? And I found one guy who suggested a solution for that. He said 500 bushels of wheat, which is the markdown from the first deal, and 400 gallons of olive oil from the second deal, that they both work out. He did the math on what he figured they were worth in the ancient world and said they both work out to about 500 denarii. Flat rate commission. Maybe. And so there's this consideration of what does this mean? Would this really be the commission, and is it really this guy's? Although it doesn't say it anywhere in the text, doesn't tell us in the story so that we would know, but this is another theory that people propose to make sense of the fact that the guy's admirable, even though he's dishonest and he wastes money of his boss's, not his own, and he's called a dishonest rascal by Jesus. Then there's the other thing, if you're paying attention to all the details, a denarii was a day's wage. So think about it this way. Just those two commissions. It says, he called in all of his boss's debtors and asked them about their bills. And then we're given two examples. We're not told those are the only two people who owe the boss money, but the first two he gives as examples, 800 bushels, mark it down to 400, 1,000, what is it here? 1,000 gallons of olive oil, it's 400 gallons of olive oil from 800, 500 bushels of wheat marked down from 1,000. Is that it? Anyway, so the markdowns happen. And he does this, and if you do the math and say a denarii is worth a day's wages, by this guy saying that there's, 500 denarii even commission each day, you're going, that's 1,000 days' wages that this dude is writing off in just two bills, right? And so he's got 1,000 days' wages that he's just saying, I won't take that, in hopes that maybe these guys will help provide for him. You're about to be out of work, not have the money to pay for food and shelter, and you're just writing off 1,000 days' wages. Does that make sense? And so the rich man is writing off over 3 years' wages just in hopes that maybe those guys will remember him when he's fired, and they'll provide a value that's worth more than 3 years' wages. Seems like a bit of a stretch, doesn't it? Do you have that kind of faith in people? Would you be saying, well, I got a nest egg, I got at least 300 3 years' wages coming to me, but I'm all right as long as I can count on my friends. I'll just give that away. And so the grappling continues. Does that make sense? And besides that fact, Jesus is telling us parables so he can teach something. And his listeners would have had no more information that we know of than this. And because it's recorded in Scripture, we're meant to try to find something from it. This is taken to be, by many, the most difficult parable to interpret and understand. And you can see why. It's kind of hard to figure out what's going on here. What is Jesus trying to say? It's no fairy tale, right? We can agree on that. And so Jesus, it's important to note that it would seem that just the first two examples of these creditors, and there were others, if we pay attention to exactly what Jesus said and pay attention to detail, the rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. And so Jesus doesn't say you've got to admire him because he's dishonest. He says he's dishonest. He says he's a rascal. But he says what you admire him for is being shrewd. That's what he said. And so he wasn't necessarily, we're not told he was admired for wasting money. He was not admired. He was fired, right? The boss doesn't say, what a good guy. You know, you wasted my money. Good on you. So that's not what he was admired for. And if he wasn't admired for being dishonest, if that's not the part that the rich man admired, then he was only being admired for being shrewd. And it's true, Jesus says, that the children of this world are more shrewd in dealing with the world around them than are the children of light. So this guy isn't a fairy tale hero. He isn't the hero that always does the right thing that you could admire and say, we should follow his example in every way. He's a flawed guy that makes all kinds of mistakes. He shouldn't be wasting his boss's money. And whether that's incompetence and he should learn more about how to handle money, or whether that's something he did on purpose and he needs to be called out for and fired is the right way to go about it. And when he's dishonest, we can say, well, that's definitely not a lesson we want to walk away with. We should go around being dishonest, and if we get away with it, good. If we get ahead in life, then it's worth it. It's justified if you get ahead, if you get away with it. If nobody catches you and you never get punished, then go ahead and do it. And so that's not the lesson. And so Jesus doesn't say that the rich man admires him for that, for his dishonesty. So he's not admired for wasting money. He's not admired for his dishonesty. He's admired only for being shrewd. So he's a flawed character that gets at least one thing right, which sounds like more some of the people we deal with, right? That make mistakes, but sometimes get it right. And so while the manager's shrewdness is different than our shrewdness. So when Jesus says this, when he says, that it's true that the children of this world are more shrewd in dealing with the world around them than the children of light are, he's saying there's a different kind of shrewdness. This guy, good on him that he was shrewd to meet his goal. His goal was to be okay and to make sure he had enough to eat and enough shelter in the future to secure his physical, financial security. And he says in the story, that the manager, the rich man says to the manager, he had to admire him. But Jesus doesn't say we should be exactly like him. He just says it's admirable to be shrewd, to be careful. And he says the children of this world are more shrewd, more careful in dealing with things, with the world around them, than are the children of light. But there are some really notable differences between what it's saying about one person and the other. We are not to follow his example fully. So while the manager's shrewdness is to secure a future in this world, to make sure he has enough to eat and he has a future in that way, Jesus, when he gives his lesson, says that we are not supposed to be securing a future in this world and for our own lives. That's not the main goal of our lives. He says we're supposed to be securing a future that's not an earthly future, it's eternity. That's what we're supposed to be concerned with. So we aren't to be looking for security in worldly sources. Jesus calls us to have as our main goal, as our main mission in the world, to secure our eternal home as motivation for how we'll handle the wealth that God entrusts us with. And so as we're looking at how we handle money, how we handle the blessings that we have materially, it shouldn't just be about comfort and security in this world, but it should be with that eternal purpose in mind. And so it's a different kind of shrewdness with a different kind of goal. And as Jesus begins to unpack that, in Luke's gospel, Luke goes on to give two more lessons after that primary parable. And so he talks about how money is handled from the teachings of Jesus, and he tacks on these two. These other two are quoted in other gospels, but this gospel is the only one that gives us the parable proper. But Luke ties those teachings together, and under the unction of the Holy Spirit says these things matter and they're related. And so here's the two lessons that put it all into context. Luke's connected the dots, inspired by God. And so Luke quotes Jesus as saying, if you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in large ones. But if you're dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. If you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in large things. He says you start with the little, you take care of those little details. You know, remember that saying back in the day, if you take care of pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves? Kind of that principle. You start from the small. You pay attention to the details in your life rather than just the big things. And he says, if you're faithful in little things, if you've decided to be a faithful person and you're faithful in little decisions, including little decisions about your money, your wealth, then you'll be faithful in large ones. But if you're dishonest in little things, you won't be honest in large things. That your faithfulness leads to faithfulness in big things, and if you're honest in little things or dishonest in little things, that'll carry over into big things too. And so Jesus is teaching there a principle about taking care of the everyday things and making sure you're moving in the right direction there to make sure you're on top of the big things. And so earthly wealth, he says, is less important than big things. And so life as a disciple, one of faithful attention to small details. This is a quote by Fred Craddock. The life of a disciple is one of a faithful attention to small decisions regarding the frequent and familiar tasks that we engage in. Like the frequent, the everyday tasks, the common stuff that we make decisions about. That the life of a disciple is paying attention to those things. One of faithful attention to those things. And so paying attention to the little things in life and making the right decision there leads to making larger right decisions because we're moving always in the same direction. We're carrying through on our ethics, even when it's a small thing. So if we're not dishonest in little things, if we're not stealing and cheating, well, it's just this, then we're being careful so that when the big decisions are made, we're staying in with that theme. We're sticking to our principles. And then here's the second lesson. Jesus says, if you are untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches of heaven? And if you're not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? If you're untrustworthy, if you're not faithful, he says, if you're not faithful with the stuff you have here, with your earthly possessions, they're not really anything related to heaven. They're not going to make an impact on heaven or what's happening in heaven. But if you're unfaithful with stuff on this world, then it transfers into the heavenly, right? If you're not looking after things here, then your values get shifted, and that will impact eternity. If you're not trustworthy about worldly wealth, then the riches of heaven is something you're not going to be faithful with either. If you're untrustworthy, who's going to trust you with the riches of heaven? If you can't be faithful while you're walking around here, isn't that going to impact your eternity and how much you're going to be the kind of person you should be in heaven's eyes? And if you're not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? And so Jesus is saying not just that it's the everyday things we need to pay attention to, but being trustworthy, being faithful, those are important. So again, that impacts our story and the parable by saying we're not admiring him for being dishonest. We're told to be faithful. We're told to be trustworthy. But we're faithful and trustworthy in this world because it's about more than just this world. Because we are concerned with eternity. We're not faithful with these things. We don't do them just as an end to justify the means. That we keep doing it this way just to get ahead like the manager did, to look after our everyday lives here. We should hold those things loosely, and we should make decisions always in light of eternity. And so as we've been talking over the last number of weeks about how we handle our money, how we handle our wealth, what we do to live with joyful generosity, understanding everything in the light of eternity and saying, I want to be faithful. I want to be trustworthy. I want to handle these things. I want to be in view of what's really important. And not just what's important in this life, but what's important in light of eternity. And so we're called to be shrewd like the manager, but we're not called to be shrewd in the same way. The difference between us and the manager in the story is that we are also to be faithful and honest. We're to be like him in being shrewd, but be completely different in his dishonesty and his wastefulness. And so the way that we handle things is that we're careful. And the way that we look after our wealth is that we are generous with it. John Wesley is quoted as saying, "Make all you can, save all you can, give all you can." He's careful with his money. He makes it, and then he's careful to save money, to not be wasteful with it. And then he says, give all you can. Like make sure you're invested in the things of the kingdom, because if you are, then you're going to make a greater impact on the world, and that's the reason to do it. You don't do it because somebody told you, and it's a duty, and I need to give this 10%, and that's it. You do the things that you do for a real reason, for an eternal reason. And so if you can't do it joyfully, if you don't enter into it as a spiritual exercise, if you don't understand that it's not because then God will owe you something in return, then you're invested in the future of your soul. You're invested not in buying from God a way into heaven, but you're becoming the kind of person that will belong in heaven. The kind of person who's honest and faithful and true and joyfully generous. And that is the goal of the kingdom. So rather than operate in light of our kingdom reward, this manager, he just operates in terms of his reward in the here and now. And so Jesus says, rather we as believers operate in light of the kingdom, our kingdom reward for being generous like King Jesus. As Jesus puts it, no one can serve two masters. You'll hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and be enslaved to money. If we're dishonest, if we seek only our personal pleasure and our personal security in things, and really we've started to serve money in a way that conflicts with our service of God. But if we are joyfully generous, if we are the kind of people that are formed by the kingdom, and so that we're honest and we're faithful in our dealings, and we handle things as if it's not just ours to do with what we want, but we are the kind of people who are kingdom people and use our resources, as Jesus said, to benefit others, not to benefit ourselves.